He was a billionaire CEO, cold, powerful, untouchable. She was his assistant, composed, invisible, and always on time. For 4 years, their lives ran parallel, divided by glass walls and polite silence, until one rainy night, he saw her cry. She thought no one was watching, but from his office, he saw everything: the quiet collapse of a woman who never asked for help. And for the first time, something cracked inside him. Who was Clara Jensen behind the tailored suits and calm voice? What pain was she carrying that not even her smile could cover? And why did her silence haunt him more than any boardroom betrayal ever could? What followed wasn't a love story. It was something deeper, about presence, redemption, and the quiet strength of staying, of rebuilding, not rescuing, of learning that sometimes the bravest thing isn't leaving, but choosing to stay. And it all began the moment he didn't look away. If this story touches something inside you, like, share, and subscribe to join us for this full journey. Let's begin. He wasn't supposed to see her cry. Not her, not here. But through the rain-specked glass of the boardroom, he did, and it shattered something in him. It was past 7. The rest of the building had gone quiet, that particular hush that settles over the city once the ambitious clamor of the day dies down. Outside, New York hummed with a sleepy drizzle, the kind that painted long streaks across tall windows and turned the streets into mirrors. Graham Whitmore stood in his corner office, staring absently into the fading skyline. Lights flickered on across the Upper East Side. Taxis moved like lazy fireflies. He should have gone home hours ago, but something had kept him there. Maybe it was the rain, maybe it was the silence, or maybe it was her. From his vantage point, the glass walls of the executive boardroom gave him an unobstructed view. The room was dimly lit, its overhead lights turned off, save for the soft golden glow of the table lamp left behind. In that muted halo sat Clara Jensen, shoulders slightly hunched, hands folded tightly in her lap. Her posture was composed, too composed, the kind of stillness that didn't come from peace, but from holding something in. And then, without warning, her head dipped. A hand lifted slowly to her face. He saw it, the trembling fingers pressing against her temple, then her mouth, a silent breath, a long pause, and then tears. She didn't sob. She didn't make a sound. That, somehow, made it harder to watch. The silence wrapped around her like glass, fragile, cold, and meant to keep people out. Graham had known Clara for nearly 4 years. She was reliable, precise, endlessly efficient. She anticipated problems before they existed. He'd seen her handle quarterly disasters, put out boardroom fires, and field condescending executives twice her age, all without so much as a frown. She was, by every visible measure, unshakable. Until now, he didn't move, didn't knock. Something about the moment felt sacred, or perhaps too raw to intrude upon. He remained behind the tinted pane, watching her unravel in the one place she'd always remained composed. There was a strange discomfort in witnessing it, like stumbling across a hidden scar on someone you thought was invincible. But it wasn't pity he felt, not exactly. It was something else, heavier, quieter, something that tightened in his chest as she wiped her cheek quickly, almost angrily, then straightened up as if pulling armor back onto her body. She gathered her papers in slow, deliberate motions, methodical, as always. But he noticed how her hands shook, just slightly. When she reached for her folder, she didn't look up. Didn't notice the man behind the wall of glass. Didn't see how he watched, not with curiosity, but with something close to ache. She stood, collected her coat, and turned toward the exit. As she did, a single sheet of paper slipped free from her folder and fluttered gently to the floor, unnoticed by her, but not by him. The door clicked shut behind her, the echo hanging in the stillness like an unanswered question. Graham hesitated, then walked toward the boardroom. The paper lay near the chair where she had sat. He reached down, expecting perhaps a memo or a meeting agenda, but what he picked up stopped him cold. It was a medical bill, Lenox Hill Hospital, pediatric endocrinology, patient name Ethan Jensen, amount due 8/4/12/63. There was something handwritten on the bottom, a small note, likely scrawled by Clara for her own tracking. Next installment due by Nov. One no exceptions. He stared at the paper for a long time, the soft hum of the HVAC system filling the silence around him. His thumb brushed over the ink where her handwriting trailed off, slightly smudged possibly by a tear. Ethan Jensen, her son. She'd mentioned him only once, years ago, briefly. He remembered thinking how little she shared about her personal life. At the time, it hadn't mattered. Clara got the job done. That was enough. Now, it felt like he'd missed something critical. His thoughts swirled. She had sat in that chair, carrying that burden alone, like always, and let herself break, just for a moment. A moment she thought no one would see. And yet, he had. He stood there, motionless, paper still in hand. His gaze drifted back toward the hallway. Already empty. She was gone. Just like that. But something inside him hadn't gone with her. It stayed behind, sitting in that empty chair, staring back at him like a question he wasn't ready to answer. And for the first time in years, years of certainty, of power, of knowing what came next, Graham Whitmore felt entirely unsure of his next move. Clara had mastered the art of disappearing in plain sight. No one ever asked if she was okay, and that was how she preferred it. Until now. Every morning began the same. The shrill cry of the alarm clock at 5:45 a.m., followed by the gentle rustling of covers as she peeled herself from bed, careful not to disturb Ethan. For those first few minutes, the apartment was hers alone, just long enough to exhale, to stand barefoot on the cold kitchen tile and breathe in the stillness before the day demanded everything from her again. The coffee pot hissed to life. Bread popped from the toaster. A lunchbox clicked shut. By 6:20, she was nudging Ethan awake with soft encouragements and warm hands, brushing curls from his forehead and checking his glucose monitor before he even opened his eyes. Mornings weren't just routines. They were rituals, a fragile system that kept their world from tilting. Her apartment was small, 2 bedrooms, 1 bath, a cracked kitchen tile near the sink she always meant to fix. The carpet had seen better years, and the radiator in Ethan's room clicked through the night in protest of the colder months ahead. But it was clean, it was safe, and it was hers barely. By 7:15, Clara had on her neatly pressed blazer, her hair pinned up just so, and her heels the same pair she'd worn for the past 3 years. The back of the left one slightly scuffed. Ethan kissed her cheek as she handed him off to the neighbor who walked him to school. She waved, watched him disappear around the hallway corner, and then turned toward the elevator, shoulders squared, expression composed. By the time she stepped into Whitmore Capital's polished marble lobby, Clara Jensen was no longer a mother, no longer tired, no longer the woman juggling overdue bills and insulin shipments. She was simply the assistant, and she was very good at it. 12 hours later, she would return home, reheat leftovers, check Ethan's levels, fold laundry in silence, and sit by the window for 10 minutes before starting it all again. It was a quiet life, exhausting, invisible, but she had made her peace with it, or so she thought. Clara hadn't cried in the office in 4 years, not once, not even when the final divorce papers came through while she was proofing a quarterly report. Not even when Ethan spent 3 nights in ICU after a hypoglycemic seizure last winter. She had become skilled at bottling the ache, disguising fatigue as focus, turning heartache into productivity. But the letter from the hospital had cracked something. It arrived Tuesday morning, folded neatly, addressed plainly, and carrying the quiet weight of urgency. Clara had opened it at her desk between back-to-back meetings, eyes scanning quickly until the words "treatment revision required insurance denied coverage" made her throat tighten. New medication, immediate, not optional. The cost, almost $3,000, up front. She folded the letter 3 times and slid it under her keyboard. She didn't cry, didn't make a sound, just nodded at the intern passing by with coffee and turned back to her screen. Later that afternoon, she submitted a request to Human Resources, a formal inquiry for overtime eligibility, citing personal financial strain. The phrasing felt clinical, detached, safe. She left out the parts about late-night panic attacks, about rationing insulin doses and cutting grocery budgets. She didn't mention the shoes Ethan had outgrown, or the way she sometimes skipped dinner without noticing. It wasn't shame, it was survival. Clara hadn't always been this way. Once, in a lifetime, that felt like someone else's. She had dreamt of writing novels by the sea. She'd studied English lit, quoted Sylvia Plath to herself in bathroom mirrors, filled spiral notebooks with half-finished stories and poems written during late-night campus shifts. Then she met Thomas. He was charming, confident, a finance major who talked about building empires over cheap diner coffee. They married young, too young, and when Ethan was born, Clara believed love would fill in the gaps where planning had failed, but it didn't. When the diagnosis came at age 3, Thomas panicked not because of Ethan's health, but because of the cost, insurance caps, specialist visits, devices and prescriptions. Within 6 months, he had walked out, taking half their savings and none of the responsibility. Clara didn't have time to mourn him. She had a son to raise, a job to find, and a future to build from what was left. She applied everywhere. Whitmore Capital wasn't even on her radar. The job listing had been a fluke, something she clicked on during a late-night search after Ethan's fever spiked, and she'd cried herself dry. Her resume was modest. No Ivy League credentials, no corporate pedigree, just a record of punctuality, resilience, and calm under pressure. What had surprised her was the interview. Graham Whitmore hadn't seemed particularly impressed with her work history. He hadn't smiled, hadn't made small talk. But at one point, when another executive barged into the meeting room ranting about a scheduling error, Clara had calmly pulled up the man's itinerary, corrected the mistake, and rescheduled the client all in under 60 seconds. Graham had watched her, eyes unreadable, and then said, "You find order in chaos." It was the only compliment he ever gave her, and yet, it was the one she held on to. 4 years passed in a blur of deadlines, meetings, and careful distance. Graham remained Graham-focused, brilliant, and cold. Clara was his right hand, his memory, his invisible armor. They never crossed lines, barely shared personal details. It was professional, clean, efficient. But now he had seen something she hadn't meant to reveal. Her tears quiet, fleeting, and uninvited. She didn't know he'd been there, didn't know he'd watched her crumble behind glass walls, didn't know he now held a piece of her private war that folded hospital bill she hadn't noticed fall from her folder. But something had changed. The next morning, Clara noticed he looked at her longer than usual during their briefing. Just for a second, she dismissed it. She buried herself in work, skipped lunch, answered emails with robotic precision, smiled when necessary, laughed on cue. But by Thursday, the cracks began to show. She paused, halfway down the hallway, realizing her heel had begun to separate from its sole again. She knelt beside the break room vending machine, trying to fasten it with a paperclip, hands trembling not from the task, but from the knowledge that she couldn't afford a new pair. At her desk, she reread the hospital letter 3 times, hoping maybe the numbers would change. They didn't. She ran through options in her head, credit card maxed, personal loan denied, asking her mother impossible. Another job, too risky. Less time for Ethan, less stability. She closed her eyes, rested her forehead against the edge of her desk, and exhaled long and low. And in the next office, Graham sat behind his desk, staring at a report he wasn't reading. His eyes kept drifting toward the corner of the glass divider, where Clara's silhouette shifted graceful, controlled, and entirely too still. It occurred to him that in 4 years, he had never once asked her if she was okay, not when her voice cracked mid-sentence one Tuesday morning. Not when she missed the holiday party without explanation. Not even when she had arrived one January with her right hand wrapped in a bandage claiming she'd cut it on a can lid. He had seen it all, and yet, somehow, seen nothing. Now. He noticed the way she kept her phone face up on the desk, always within reach. The way she rarely spoke during lunch. How her eyes darted toward the clock every hour. He noticed the fray on her cuffs, the slight limp in her step by evening, the way she clutched her bag tightly as she left. He noticed, and for the first time, he began to wonder how long she'd been carrying the weight of an entire world, all on her own. He didn't speak of it. She didn't thank him, but every morning, her favorite coffee appeared on her desk, still warm. It was the small kindnesses that began to change the air between them, quiet shifts in routine that weren't announced, not written in memos or acknowledged in hallway chatter. Graham Whitmore had never been a man of gestures. He gave directives, not gifts. He moved markets, not people. But lately, something inside him had shifted. It began with the coffee, a plain white cup from a small cafe 2 blocks away. Not the company's standard brew. This one had a handwritten initial on the side C, and a faint cinnamon scent that Clara loved but never ordered aloud. She found it one morning already at her desk, still warm, no note, no explanation. She almost returned it, assuming a mix-up, but she paused, looked around, and sipped. The next day, it was there again. She said nothing. The following week, the department's weekly 6 p. Wismian strategy call quietly moved to 4:30. No explanation given. Her evenings opened up just enough to get home before the sky turned fully dark. It meant one more hour with Ethan. One more story read without yawns. One less dinner eaten from a microwave tray. Then came the bonus notice. A company-wide email announced a new Performance and Resilience Recognition Initiative, a line item in the annual review tied to individual consistency and reliability. The amount wasn't enormous, but for Clara, it was the difference between stress and survival, enough to cover Ethan's new medication for at least 2 months. She knew. Of course, she knew. It wasn't coincidence. These weren't random administrative changes. But she didn't speak of it. She couldn't. Hope was dangerous. Gratitude, even more so. She feared that naming these small mercies would unravel them. That gratitude would be mistaken for invitation, or, worse, pity. And yet, each morning, she walked into the office and felt seen, not spoken to, not fussed over, just quietly, intentionally considered, and that was new. Graham hadn't planned any of it, not in the usual way. He wasn't trying to fix her problems or rescue anyone. That wasn't his style. But after that night, the one where he'd seen her cry behind the glass, something lodged in his chest refused to let go. He'd tried, at first, to rationalize it. Clara was an exceptional assistant, efficient, focused, loyal. She deserved recognition. She had always deserved more. But the truth was more complicated. There was something about her stillness that reminded him of someone else, someone buried in a different season of his life. His brother, Henry, younger by 2 years, a jazz pianist with a laugh louder than life itself. Henry had been diagnosed with type 1 diabetes at 15. By 18, he was gone a late diagnosis of ketoacidosis, a missed alarm, a night too quiet to notice. Graham had been in college then, finals week. He still remembered the call, the way his mother's voice broke before his own name left her lips. Henry had been the dreamer, the feeler. Graham had built walls from that loss, thick enough to keep out everything but logic and order. Until Clara. Until her son. Until a silent cry behind glass walls cracked something open that had long been sealed. He didn't tell anyone, not even his therapist, not yet. But each time he saw Clara, hair pulled back, lips pressed in determination, shoulders squared against whatever storm she wasn't naming, he remembered Henry, the quiet strength, the quiet pain, and he couldn't walk past it anymore. Weeks passed, autumn deepened, the city turned gold. Ethan's drawings began appearing in Clara's bag, crumpled superhero sketches with capes made of Excel spreadsheets and ties that shot laser beams. One had a label, G. Biu, Office Super Guy. Clara found it one morning during a board meeting and almost laughed aloud. The image was ridiculous. Graham's square jaw, exaggerated in pencil, flying through the sky holding a steaming cup of coffee and a folder. She folded the paper quietly, tucked it into her notebook, and smiled. The first real smile in months. That night, she told Ethan she liked his drawing. He beamed and said, "He's like Iron Man, but with budgets." She didn't correct him, didn't explain the complexity of power and kindness. She just kissed his forehead and let the boy believe in heroes a little longer. Inside the office, nothing was said. Their conversations remained clipped, professional. But Graham noticed the smile. It was small, fleeting, but there, and it shook him more than it should have. He found himself listening for the sound of her heels in the hallway, watching the clock when she didn't appear on time, noticing the curve of her signature, the scent of her scarf, the way she paused before answering difficult questions as if weighing not just the answer, but the emotional cost of offering it. He had never felt this curious, not in a possessive way, not in a romantic cliché, just drawn. One evening, after everyone else had left, he lingered near the break room, staring out at the fog that rolled over the city like slow breath. Clara's door was ajar. He hadn't meant to eavesdrop, but her voice floated gently into the hallway. "No, I'm staying here." "Yes." The offer was generous. "But I owe someone here a thank you I haven't had the courage to give." Silence. Then the click of her mouse, a sigh, and soft humming, the tune of a lullaby he couldn't place. Graham backed away before she noticed him, returned to his office, sat at his desk but didn't open his laptop. Instead, he let the words echo. A thank you I haven't had the courage to give. It wasn't pride that kept her silent. It was something older, more tender, something that asked to be handled without assumptions. He thought of Henry again, of the way his little brother had once said, "Sometimes people say nothing because it's the only way to keep everything from falling apart." That night, Graham didn't go home right away. He climbed to the rooftop terrace, the private one reserved for executive retreats and year-end celebrations. The wind was sharp, biting through his coat, lifting his collar as if trying to shake him awake. He stood at the edge, hands deep in his pockets, looking out over the city, 100 stories high, with a billion lights below, and all he could think about was one woman who had become more than a file, more than a task, one woman whose quiet strength had anchored his days without him realizing. And now she was inside his mind in ways he couldn't explain. He heard her voice in his head during morning briefings. He anticipated her reactions before meetings. He noticed when she wore her hair differently, when she was tired, when she was guarding something she wouldn't name. He thought of her eyes that night, glassy, distant, vulnerable. And he wondered, when did I stop being her boss and start becoming something else? It wasn't the loud arguments that broke her. It was the silence that came afterward and the storms she had to weather alone. The rain came hard that night, slicing across the city like a whispered warning. Wind curled around the buildings, tugging at traffic lights and rattling window panes. Clara stepped off the subway with her coat pulled tight and her shoulders braced against the cold. It was nearly 9 p.m. Her last meeting had run late again. She hadn't checked her phone in the last hour. She should have. When she walked into the apartment, she sensed it immediately, the wrongness. The too still air. The glow of the nightlight casting long shadows across the floor. "Ethan," she called softly, slipping out of her heels, dropping her bag. No response. She crossed the hallway to his room, flicked on the light. He was curled in bed, pale, damp with sweat. His breathing was shallow, too shallow. Her heart leapt. The monitor blinked red, low, dangerously low. Clara didn't panic, not externally. Panic was a luxury she'd trained herself to avoid. She moved fast, her body running on instinct, Glucose gel, cool cloth, a whispered plea, a call to the emergency line. Her voice calm, too calm, as she recited their address. She didn't cry, not even when the paramedics carried him out, his head lolling against her chest, but her hands shook, and the silence between her heartbeats roared like thunder. At Lenox Hill Hospital, the walls smelled of antiseptic and artificial lemon. The lights buzzed overhead. Clara sat beside Ethan's bed, her fingers resting gently over his small wrist. The IV bag dripped rhythmically. Machines beeped and blinked their strange, familiar language. He was stable now, sleeping. Her hair clung to her face in damp strands. She hadn't eaten. She hadn't changed clothes. She didn't care. It was nearly dawn when she drifted into sleep, chin tucked against her chest, hand still resting on his. She didn't know what time it was when the nurse came in with fresh linens, or when the doctor gently explained the new treatment plan. She nodded, listened, memorized, and she definitely didn't notice the tall figure who stepped quietly into the doorway, pausing before entering. Graham had woken up with a strange sense of unease. At first, he thought it was nothing, perhaps too much coffee, or the memory of Clara's quiet voice in his head, echoing from nights before. But when he arrived at the office, it was unmistakable. Her desk was empty. That wasn't unusual. Not at 7:45 but by 9:00, it was still empty. No call, no text, no calendar notification, no out-of-office reply. Her morning report hadn't arrived. The spreadsheet she'd been working on was left untouched. For Clara Jensen, that was a red flag the size of a billboard. He waited until 10 Londra pacing near the espresso machine, fingers tapping a rhythm against his watch. Then, without thinking twice, he called HR. They hadn't heard from her either. She hadn't called in, hadn't logged into the system. There was a pause, the kind people make when trying to avoid sounding concerned. Should we contact her emergency contact? Someone asked. No, Graham said quietly. I'll handle it. He didn't tell them why he knew where to go. He just grabbed his coat and left. The hospital was colder than he remembered. Too much white. Too many beeping machines. He asked the nurse at the front desk if there was a patient named Ethan Jensen. The woman nodded, checked her chart, then led him to the pediatric wing. Room 214. He stepped in softly. There, in the low light of early morning, he saw her, Clara, slumped in a plastic chair beside Ethan's bed, body folded inward, asleep but not resting. Her hand lay over the boy's arm, as if tethering him to this world. Her shoulders were rounded, blouse slightly wrinkled, the sleeves stained with rain and maybe something else. Ethan's small chest rose and fell. The boy looked so fragile, so young. Graham's throat tightened. He didn't say a word, didn't move forward, just stood there a silent witness again. A storm, not of thunder, but of tenderness, pressed against his ribs. He thought of Henry, of hospital rooms, of not getting there in time. This time, he had... Clara stirred. Her eyes fluttered open slowly, pupils adjusting. For a moment, she looked disoriented, caught between sleep and fear. Then she saw him. She blinked once, twice, sat up, her entire body tensed, spine straightening with a jolt of panic. Mr. Whitmore. She stopped herself, lips trembling. She looked at the clock. Nearly 11 Zures. Oh my God. I didn't. Graham raised a hand, just slightly, not to silence her, but to still the spiral he saw rising. No, he said just that. Quiet, firm. She stared at him, eyes wide, glassy. I didn't call. I meant to. Ethan collapsed. No explanation needed, he said again. There was no reprimand, no formality, no clipped professionalism, just presence. That undid her more than words could have. She nodded, lips pressed tight, trying to hold back tears she wasn't ready to explain. Graham glanced at Ethan. He looks peaceful, he murmured. Clara followed his gaze. It was close. She whispered, and that was all either of them said. He didn't stay long. Before he left, he placed a folded piece of paper on the bedside table, just beside Ethan's stuffed fox. Then he turned, gave Clara a soft nod, and disappeared down the hallway without looking back. Clara found the note that evening, after the second round of nurse checks and the quiet returned. It wasn't long, just a few words, written in careful, deliberate ink. You have a superhero. Her name is Mom. You'll be you. She stared at it for a long time. Something cracked, not like glass, but like ice giving way to warmth beneath. Tears came, but they weren't the helpless kind. They were the kind that came when someone finally saw you, fully, without judgment, without noise, just presence. She pressed the note to her chest, closed her eyes, and for the first time in a long while, she let herself feel held. They didn't say a word, yet the whispers started louder than thunder. It began the way these things often do in elevators and break rooms, by the copy machine, near the coffee cart that served burnt lattes in waxy cups. A sideways glance, a lifted brow, a silent stretch just a beat too long, and then the whisper. She wasn't at her desk for 3 days, and now her bonus is tripled. Graham rescheduled the entire strategy summit just so she could get home early. I saw her coming out of his office late last night. None of it was said with malice. Not directly. That was the elegance of corporate rumor. It wrapped itself in concern, in just curious, in maybe I'm reading too much into it. But the damage was the same. By the end of the week, Clara could feel the shift in the air before she stepped off the elevator. Colleagues who once offered polite nods now looked straight ahead. Her name was spoken with a tone that curled upward at the end, as if it now came with a question mark. She wasn't asked to join meetings she usually organized. A coffee order that once included her cinnamon oat latte came back with only black brews and burnt decaf. She knew. They were watching. It had taken years to build her reputation. Clara Jensen, the assistant who never missed a detail, never crossed a line, never lingered at lunch, never made things about herself. And now, it was unraveling thread by silent thread. She kept her head down, focused, responded to emails with perfect grammar and perfectly timed replies. But something inside her shifted, because this wasn't just about whispers. This time, someone was listening and taking notes. It was Howard Trent who pulled the first thread, a senior member of the board, old Wall Street blood with a square jaw and sharper tongue. He'd always had a bone to pick with Graham, back from the days when they competed for the same seat at another firm, a deal that Graham had won and Howard had never forgiven. So, when the rumors reached his ears, he didn't raise his voice. He raised an eyebrow, then he raised the issue, an internal audit, a review of discretionary expenditures, a routine inquiry into whether company funds had been used appropriately, especially those tagged under personnel performance adjustments. It wasn't the investigation that stung, it was the assumption baked inside it. Clara was called into a private conference room on the 43rd floor, no windows, a long oak table. 2 executives she barely knew sat across from her, one with a tablet, one with a file folder. "We're simply following up on some irregularities," said the man with the tablet. "No need to be alarmed." But alarm wasn't what Clara felt. It was humiliation. "We noticed a performance bonus issued outside of the normal cycle," he continued. "Unusual, especially without full documentation, and a sudden adjustment to your meeting hours. Unprecedented flexibility." "I didn't request it," Clara said softly. "Did you object to it?" She hesitated. "No, I didn't know I was supposed to." He nodded, scribbled something. The woman beside him leaned forward. "Is there anything personal between you and Mr. Whitmore?" Clara looked up. For a moment, she said nothing. Then, calmly, "No." "Would you characterize your relationship as strictly professional?" A pause. "Yes." The woman studied her. "Are you aware that perception, especially in executive environments, can carry the weight of fact?" Clara blinked. I am. They said thank you, told her someone would follow up. She left the room with hands steady, but stomach churning. Outside the door, someone looked away too quickly. The storm had arrived. Graham heard about the inquiry the next morning. He didn't speak, didn't slam anything, just sat very still. Then he stood, walked to the head of the floor, and asked Clara to step into his office. When she arrived, she didn't sit, just stood there, coat still on. Expression unreadable. I didn't know they would. He started. I know, she said. I didn't request the audit. He added, I know. There was a silence between them. Not awkward, just tired. I never wanted any of this to affect you, he said quietly. It was always going to affect me, she replied. Her voice wasn't angry. It was factual, like weather. He looked at her for a long time. Do you want me to speak to the board? No. You shouldn't have to defend something that never happened. No, she repeated. Because if you do, they'll only see what they want to see, and you'll lose more than I will. She turned to leave, but paused at the door. You were kind, she said. That's all. And then she was gone. The decision came that Friday. Administrative suspension, 2 weeks, unpaid, officially cited as internal review pending clarification of procedural discrepancies. Unofficially, a quiet punishment, dressed up in policy, a message sent through silence. Clara packed her things into a small box. No one helped. No one met her eyes. Her desk had always been pristine. Now, it looked erased. She paused at the elevator, holding her coat in one hand, the box in the other. The doors opened. No one inside. She stepped in. The doors began to close. And then Clara. She turned halfway. For a moment, she didn't recognize his voice, not because of the tone, but because of the way it cracked. Graham was standing there, breath caught, eyes fierce. He said her name again, but this time, she didn't turn around. The doors closed between them, and just like that, the quiet swallowed everything. That night, back at the apartment, Ethan waited on the couch with his sketchbook on his knees. Did you have a bad day, he asked, looking up. Clara tried to smile. It didn't come. I have a little time off, she said. Ethan tilted his head. Did you get fired? No, sweetheart. Not exactly. He looked down, picked at the corner of his drawing. Was it? Because of me? Clara knelt in front of him, her hands gently cupping his face. No, she whispered. Never. You are the reason I keep showing up, not the reason anything falls apart. He nodded slowly, and she pulled him close. But that night, after he was asleep, she sat by the window, arms wrapped around herself, and felt the ache bloom not from guilt, but from loss, not of a job, but of dignity, of place, of being able to walk through a hallway and not wonder what they were thinking. She had survived worse, but this was the kind of storm that didn't scream. It whispered, and it left bruises where no one could see. She never sent the letter, but she wrote it anyway and tucked it beneath a stack of unpaid bills. It was late October, the kind of gray afternoon when the sun forgets to show up and the wind weaves through the alleys like a whisper with unfinished business. Clara sat by the window in her apartment, a cup of cold tea untouched beside her, the rain drawing faint veins down the glass. The letter lay half folded on the table, not an official resignation. Not exactly. More of a goodbye in disguise. Her handwriting was careful, deliberate, a little shaky in places. Dear Mr. Whitmore, I wanted to thank you for seeing me when I didn't know I was visible, for the coffee, for the silence that never felt empty. I don't know what happens next, but I wanted you to know. You made the storm feel quieter, even just for a little while. Clara Jensen. She read it once, twice, then slid it under a pile of hospital receipts and overdue notices on the kitchen counter, a small paper heart tucked between things too heavy to carry all at once. And she didn't send it. Not because she didn't mean it, but because meaning it hurt. At the office, the space Clara once filled had become a strange sort of echo. Her desk remained empty, her chair untouched, Her scent soft and faint like lavender and rain had begun to fade. Graham noticed. He noticed in the way the mornings felt too quiet, the schedules too cold. He noticed in the missing rhythm of her presence how she used to refill the pen cup with the blue ones he liked, how she always left the blinds cracked just enough for natural light. He noticed it in himself, in the way he opened emails, hoping for her name, in the way he still brought 2 coffees to meetings, and most of all, in the way he kept reading the note she had left, the one tucked under his office planner, found the morning after her suspension. It wasn't long, just 2 sentences. Thank you for the kindness you never had to give. I hope someone remembers to ask if you're okay too. He didn't understand how handwriting could feel like a voice, but hers did. He could see her in every curve of every letter, her strength, and the quiet ache behind it. The city carried on. It always did. But Graham found himself slipping out of meetings early, avoiding board dinners, sitting in his car outside buildings he didn't remember driving to. One Saturday, he ended up in Queens. It wasn't planned, he just drove. The address was written in the corner of a school emergency form he still had in a confidential folder. Clara's emergency contact, Elaine Jensen, Bayside Senior Living. The receptionist at the front desk wore a pumpkin pin on her cardigan and offered him a polite smile. Room 204, she said. She might be dozing, but she'll be happy for a visit. Graham didn't know what he was doing. Not exactly. He'd negotiated billion-dollar deals, built empires, but walking into that modest room with a crocheted blanket on the chair, faded photos on the shelf, and the scent of peppermint tea in the air, he felt more unprepared than he had in years. Elaine Jensen looked up from her magazine with the sharp, clear eyes of a woman who had seen too much to be surprised anymore. "You're Graham," she said, not asked. He nodded. She didn't offer her hand, just gestured toward the chair by the window. "She talks about you less than she should," Elaine said, her voice dry but not unkind, "which means you matter more than you realize." Graham didn't know what to say, so he said the only thing that felt honest, "I don't think I've done right by her." Elaine smiled, not warmly, but knowingly. No one really does. Not the first time. They talked about nothing, about everything. She told him about Clara's first story, written in crayon and misspelled, about a girl who opened a bookstore by the sea and gave away books to children with sad eyes. She wanted to go to college in Maine, Elaine said softly. Had a scholarship too. But then Ethan came, and she stayed. She never said. Graham murmured. She doesn't say much. Elaine replied, "That's why people assume she's fine." They sat in silence for a while. Then Elaine looked at him, not hard, but direct. "Do you care for her?" she asked. It wasn't a trap. It was a lifeline. Graham didn't answer right away. He watched the wind brush the bare trees outside the window. Thought of Clara's laughter, the rare, quiet kind. Thought of the tired curve of her shoulders, the way she held the world together with paper clips and coffee spoons and an iron will. "Yes," he said finally. "I don't know when it happened, but I do." Elaine nodded, not surprised. Then don't let her keep thinking she has to walk alone. That was all she said. But it was enough. That evening, Graham stood on a quiet sidewalk in Brooklyn, staring at a bookstore that no longer opened. The sign was still there. Sand and Spine, hand-painted and sun-faded. The windows were covered in brown paper. Inside, he could just make out the outline of shelves and a counter with a dusty cash register. Someone had left a bookmark pressed against the glass. "Stories Save Us." It read, in cursive. He didn't know why he'd come here, except he did. Clara had told him once, in passing, that she loved the ocean. That bookstores felt like places where the world made sense. Now, standing in front of one that never became hers, he saw what she had buried under quiet and resilience. A life not chosen, a dream put away, a woman who had given everything and never once asked for anything in return. And in that reflection, Graham saw something else too. Himself, standing there, hands in his coat pockets, wind tugging at his collar, face drawn with decisions that were no longer just business. There were no boardrooms here, no policies, just heart. And he finally knew what he had to do. He hadn't spoken to the press in years. But that morning, every major outlet was there waiting to hear what he'd say about the woman they called a scandal. The conference room on the 27th floor had never held this many cameras, cables coiled like vines across the floor, microphones clustered like thorns on the podium. Light panels washed the space in artificial day, drowning out the gray dawn beyond the windows. Graham stood behind the glass wall, hands in his pockets, watching the media file and producers with clipboards, reporters rehearsing intros, flashes already going off as if they could photograph the silence before the storm. He didn't call his communications team, didn't ask legal to vet his notes, didn't run his speech through filters. This was not about business. This was about dignity, and about a woman who had given so much of it away, without ever asking for any in return. He adjusted his cufflinks, took one last breath, and stepped up to the microphone. "Good morning," he began, voice calm but unpolished. It wasn't the CEO voice, not the one the press was used to. No performative charisma, no sharp polish, just Graham, a man with something to say. "I know many of you are here for a statement," he continued. "There's been a lot of speculation over the past few weeks about internal investigations, about company culture, and most recently, about one of our own. Flashes went off, pens scratched. I'm not here to manage optics," he said. "I'm here to tell you something I should have said a long time ago." He paused. "Then Clara Jensen is one of the most honest, competent, and selfless professionals I've ever had the privilege to work with." A murmur rippled through the room. Graham didn't flinch. For 4 years, she showed up, on time, in the shadows, carrying more than her share, not just of this company's weight, but of a life few people ever saw. He looked at the row of journalists' faces still, but alert. None of you saw her staying late to proof contracts that weren't hers. None of you saw her coming in on weekends to prep meetings she wasn't paid to attend. None of you saw her juggling a sick child's needs with grace that would humble most executives. He could hear his heartbeat now, not in panic, but in precision. "I did, and I still didn't see enough." Silence. "That's on me," he said. "I didn't know she was struggling. I didn't ask the right questions. I assumed silence meant stability, that professionalism meant peace." His voice dipped low, steady. It didn't. A few cameras zoomed closer. A reporter from the Wall Street Journal lowered her pen and simply listened. "I gave her a performance bonus because she earned it, not because of favoritism. I brought her coffee because, after everything she gave, it was the least I could do. I adjusted schedules because she was too proud to ask, and too loyal to stop showing up." He took a step forward. No podium now, just him. "I never touched her, never compromised her, but I did let her carry more than she should have." Another pause. "I've been in boardrooms for 20 years. I've built things, bought things, negotiated with men twice my age and half my values. But none of that taught me what I should have known, that integrity doesn't always shout. Sometimes it's quiet, invisible, female, a gasp, soft but audible." She didn't defend herself publicly because she knew the world wouldn't listen. So, I'm here to say it not as a CEO, but as a man who's finally learned to see what was in front of him. A hush fell across the room, a different kind of silence, the kind that bends time. Clara Jensen is not a scandal. She is a lesson, one I am still learning. He stepped back, no questions taken, no exit cue, just a nod, and then he walked out. He didn't return to his office right away. Instead, he took the elevator to the rooftop, the same one where months ago. He had stood in the wind and wondered how one woman had come to mean so much without ever asking for anything. Now, the wind was still, but something else was moving. Inside, downstairs, the press buzzed. The statement was already trending. CEO defends assistant in emotional address. Graham Whitmore says, "I failed to see her" in viral clip, "kindness, not scandal." What today's speech meant for women in the workplace. Some criticized it, called it calculated. Others called it reckless, but many called it human. And in a world where headlines were often just noise, this one rang like a bell in the fog. That evening, Graham returned to his office. The city lights blinked on, one by one outside the windows. Like stars rehearsing for a play they weren't sure anyone still watched. He poured a glass of water, loosened his tie, sat down, and there, on his desk, was an envelope, unmarked, no postage, inside a piece of paper, folded twice. He opened it, crayon, handwritten, block letters. "Thank you for being brave for my mom. Ethan." He stared at it, read it again and again. His hand didn't shake, but his chest did. It wasn't corporate language, wasn't a PR win, wasn't polished. It was real. And something inside him, something old, something quiet broke. Not in grief, not in regret, but in release. For the first time in years, Graham Whitmore put his head in his hands and wept. He didn't cry loudly, didn't sob, but the tears came slow, warm, necessary, like rain on ground that hadn't felt water in far too long. It wasn't just about Clara, it was about all the years he'd kept the world at arm's length, all the rooms he'd walked into without really being present, all the names he'd forgotten and the one he'd finally remembered, Clara Jensen, not his assistant, not his employee, just Clara, the woman who made him want to do more than succeed, the woman who made him want to be good. He looked at the note again. "Thank you for being brave for my mom." Graham folded it carefully, slipped it into the inner pocket of his jacket, and for the first time in a long, long while he felt lighter, not because the world had forgiven him, but because he had finally stopped hiding from himself. She didn't hide, she just needed a place the world couldn't follow. The town of Wellfleet, Massachusetts. Didn't ask questions. It was the kind of place that let you arrive quietly and let the sea speak for you. The streets smelled of salt and old cedar. The sidewalks curved past art galleries, antique stores, and weather-worn homes with porch swings that creaked like gentle sighs. The mornings were slow, the afternoons quiet, and the evenings held the kind of silence that wasn't empty, just content. Clara rented a small cottage near the bay. One bedroom, a writing desk by the window, a kitchen where Ethan could spread out his Lego sets. There was a fireplace with soot in the brick, a kettle that whistled too soon, and an old screen door that squeaked when the wind shifted. She didn't leave a forwarding address. Not because she didn't want to be found, but because she didn't want to explain. Not yet. Each morning, she walked Ethan to the small school 2 blocks away, tucked behind a white church, with a broken bell tower and a maple tree that turned gold too early. He adjusted faster than she did. Children are like that. They find rhythm before memory has time to object. She watched him blend into recess games and spelling bees. Watched the way his shoulders relaxed when the sea was near. He was sleeping better, smiling more. The circles under his eyes were fading. Clara, though, she was still remembering how to breathe. The bookstore sat on the corner of Main and Bay Street, with ivy crawling up the side like a secret. It was called The Nest, and the sign above the door was carved wood, faded and soft at the edges. She worked part-time, shelving paperbacks, recommending cookbooks, and organizing readings for the handful of tourists who stumbled in between beach walks. There was a bell over the door that chimed every time someone entered, a soft, silver note that felt like an exhale. She liked the sound of it. It reminded her that things could begin quietly. In the back of the store, there was a table round, oak, scarred by decades of elbows and coffee rings, where she began to write again. Nothing structured, no outlines, just thoughts, fragments. Sometimes, Ethan would sit beside her, drawing pictures of superheroes in business suits. Sometimes, she'd write poems on the back of receipts. Sometimes, she'd start a sentence and stop halfway, unsure if it was memory or fiction. But slowly, word by word, something returned. Her voice, herself, the parts of her that hadn't had room in the city. Still, some things clung to her like the salt in the air, invisible, but always there. The unfinished conversations, the press, the elevator doors that closed before she turned around, and the man she hadn't stopped thinking about. One evening, as the tide pulled in and the gulls retreated inland, Ethan crawled into her lap on the porch swing. They were wrapped in an old blanket, watching the sky bruise into dusk. "Mom, do you think he knows you still remember him?" Clara didn't speak at first. The swing moved gently beneath them, creaking like an old secret. She brushed his hair from his face, kissed the top of his head. "I don't know," she whispered, but Ethan just nodded, as if the answer had already been said in the spaces between words. The following Monday, the owner of the bookstore, a woman named Ruth, who smelled of sandalwood and wore scarves year-round, called Clara to the front desk. "There's something for you," she said, sliding a package across the counter. It was wrapped in brown paper, tied with twine. No return address. Clara's name, in familiar handwriting, was the only thing on the front. Her heart did a quiet somersault. She untied the string with trembling fingers. Inside was a book, a real book, glossy cover, her name on it, Saltwater Things, by Clara Jensen. She gasped. It was the collection she'd written at 22 short stories and poems she never showed anyone. She'd typed it on a borrowed laptop during late nights at college, printed it once, and left the only copy in a dusty box in her mother's attic. She turned the book over. The publisher's logo was discreet, but real. There was even a dedication to the woman who thought her voice was small. It was never small. It was just waiting for the right shore. Her eyes burned. Tucked inside the front cover was a note cream-colored cardstock, folded twice. No signature, just 7 words, written in ink. "Don't forget who you are, G." That night, she didn't sleep. She sat on the porch with the book in her lap and the wind curling around her ankles. She read her own words, really read them as if they belonged to someone else, someone brave, someone whole. And slowly, page by page, she began to believe again in the girl who had written them, the one who loved stories, the one who stayed behind for her son, the one who didn't ask for help, but who finally had been seen. Ethan found her the next morning, barefoot, holding the book like a secret. He grinned. "You look happy," he said. Clara looked at him, at the light in his eyes, at the way the sea breeze danced through his hair. "I think I am," she said, and for the first time in a very long while, she meant it. She didn't come back to win anything. She came back because it was time. The train pulled into Penn Station just after noon. The platform was crowded, a familiar chaos of rolling suitcases, announcements echoing from tinny speakers, and people moving like they had somewhere to be and not a second to waste. But Clara moved slowly, not because she was afraid, because she wasn't. She held Ethan's hand as they stepped into the light of the city autumn, now curling at the edges, painting the trees in Central Park with flame-colored leaves and softening the sky with an early golden haze. New York hadn't changed, but she had. She didn't return to the old apartment. It had been let go, along with a version of herself that no longer fit. Instead, she booked a small Airbnb near Chelsea, exposed brick, creaky floors, windows that opened just enough to let in the sounds of traffic and pigeons. Ethan ran from room to room with the wide-eyed wonder only children seem to keep no matter how much they've seen. Clara stood by the window, watching the city move beneath her, the taxis, the couples in coats, the life she used to chase, and she didn't feel behind anymore. She felt ready. The conference was held in a repurposed art loft near Soho. Warm lights, folding chairs, simple banners printed with purpose, women leading forward. It wasn't a large event, maybe 40 attendees, small name tags, bigger conversations. Clara sat near the back. No one knew who she was, and for once, that felt like a gift. She listened to women share stories of balancing ambition with motherhood, of reclaiming their voice after being overlooked, of failing loudly and rising quietly. It felt like being in a room of mirrors, but the kind that didn't distort, the kind that reminded her she wasn't alone. The final speaker was introduced as a surprise guest. A hush fell. Clara felt it before she saw it. The shift, the stillness. Then Graham. He stepped onto the small stage, not in a tailored suit this time, but in a dark sweater and blazer. He looked older, or maybe just more real. She hadn't seen him in 65 days. But who was counting? He didn't see her at first. He spoke not about markets or leadership or disruption, but about responsibility, about kindness, about the quiet power of the people behind the glass walls, about starting over. And then, as his eyes scanned the room, they found hers. He didn't flinch, he didn't smile, he just looked, and she looked back, long enough for everything unsaid to feel heard. After the talk, the crowd thinned, business cards changed hands, cups of tea were refilled, and still, they didn't speak, not yet. But when Clara stepped into the hallway, he was already there waiting near the coat rack, holding an envelope. No words, just a glance. He handed it to her. She opened it, a single page. At the top, appointment letter. Beneath it, her name, Director, Light in the Ledger Foundation, a non-profit initiative committed to supporting single mothers through financial literacy, child care stipends, and emotional wellness programs. She looked up. Graham's voice was low, even measured. I sold part of my shares. It felt overdue. She blinked. He wasn't selling her a role. He was offering a place to belong. She didn't ask why, or when, or what this meant for them, because it was all already there in the way he looked at her like she had never been invisible, in the way he had taken something he once used to build walls and turned it into light. She smiled, not big, not dramatic, just enough for her eyes to glisten. She folded the letter slowly, then nodded. Some stories are rewritten, not in ink, but in courage. The new office was small, just 2 rooms, and a view of the park where sycamore trees bent in the breeze like old men whispering secrets. The walls were bare at first, but Clara brought life in slowly. A framed photo of Ethan at the science fair, a ceramic mug that said progress, not perfection, a worn copy of The Little Prince, gifted from a woman at the shelter the foundation supported. It wasn't a corner suite, but it was hers. Light in the Ledger began with just 4 women. They came quietly, single mothers, tired but proud. Women who had memorized bus schedules better than birthdays. Women who had given up careers, degrees, even their own names, all for the sake of surviving another Monday. Clara didn't give them advice. She gave them room to speak, to rest, to breathe. Some days they cried, some days they laughed at things only women who had stretched grocery money into miracles could understand. Clara saw herself in each of them, not as a mirror, but as a memory. She wasn't trying to fix them. She was walking beside them, one hand still holding the map she'd once drawn in the dark. Outside the office, her life became simpler and richer. Ethan thrived. He was taller now, less quiet, still carrying his bag of medical supplies, but with the casual confidence of someone who no longer felt different, just equipped. He started a blog, Living Low, he called it, short posts typed in the evenings, always ending with one of his illustrations, a cartoon of his day insulin pens drawn like superhero gadgets. Graham crackers with capes, his mom with a crown made of coffee beans. The blog caught on, parents emailed, nurses shared it. One teacher from Colorado called it the realest thing I've ever read about childhood illness. Ethan never bragged, but Clara noticed how he began to walk a little straighter, like maybe healing wasn't just a thing that happened to people, but a thing they could pass on. Graham kept his distance, not out of coldness, out of respect. He never interfered with Clara's decisions at the foundation, never asked for updates, never sat in on meetings unless invited, but she saw his fingerprints in the background. The anonymous donor who covered the first round of scholarships, the accountant who worked pro bono, the soft renovations that made the office feel less like a handout and more like a haven. He checked in exactly once, a short email. Proud of what you're building. Let me know if you need anything. Or nothing at all? Gee, she never replied, not because she was unsure, but because sometimes silence can hold more grace than explanation. Then, one evening, as she was preparing Ethan's bedtime tea and checking tomorrow's grant schedule, her son looked up from his laptop and said almost too casually, "Why haven't you told him you forgive him?" She turned slowly. Who, she asked, though she already knew. Graham. She didn't answer right away. Instead, she stirred the honey into Ethan's cup, watching it spiral like soft gold, dissolving. "I don't think he needs me to," she said finally. Ethan tilted his head. "But maybe you to." He didn't say it like a challenge, just a truth. Children had a way of handing you your heart without warning. Clara sat down. She looked out the window. The city lights were blinking awake. The world didn't pause, but something inside her did. Had she forgiven him? She thought back to the boardroom whispers, the walk to the elevator, the first cup of coffee he ever left on her desk. She thought of the bookstore in Wellfleet, the printed manuscript, the look in his eyes that never demanded, only offered. Yes, she had, but she hadn't told herself yet. That night, after Ethan was asleep and the tea had gone cold, Clara sat at her desk, not in her office, but at home with a clean sheet of stationery. She didn't write a long letter, just a few lines. I don't think it was ever about the apology, or the hurt, or the headlines. I think it was always about whether I believed I mattered, and somehow, you helped me believe I did. That's enough. See, she didn't address it, didn't sign it with full names, just folded it carefully, placed it in an envelope. The next morning, on her way to work, she walked to Graham's building, the same lobby she once crossed with folders in hand and exhaustion in her shoulders. She didn't go upstairs, just slipped the envelope into the mail slot labeled Executive, and left. No expectations, no ceremony, just peace. The kind that comes when a story ends not with punctuation, but with possibility. No rings, no flowers, just pancakes, 2 mugs of coffee, and a quiet promise between 2 souls who'd found their way back. It was early, not yet 9, when Clara heard the knock, soft, unhurried, as if whoever stood on the other side already knew she was awake, but didn't want to startle the quiet that wrapped itself around Sunday mornings. She opened the door. There he was, Graham, dressed not in pressed shirts or boardroom grays, just a worn navy sweater, sleeves pushed to the elbows, and a paper bag in one hand. In the other, a small, cloth-bound book. She raised an eyebrow, unsure whether to laugh or cry. He simply said, "Breakfast." They sat at the small kitchen table, morning light slanting through the blinds and painting the floor in thin gold lines. The pancakes smelled of cinnamon and melted butter. Clara sliced hers carefully, watching the syrup pool around the edges like warm amber. Across from her, Graham poured coffee, not asking how she liked it, just knowing. Milk, no sugar, like always. The silence wasn't awkward. It was familiar, like the space between heartbeats when 2 people are fully present. Ethan shuffled in with bed hair and sleep still clinging to his eyes. He paused at the sight of Graham, then grinned. "You brought pancakes." "I did," Graham said. Ethan took a seat like it was the most natural thing in the world, and just like that, they were a table of 3, not a ceremony, not a statement, just pancakes, coffee, and something that tasted a little like beginning. The book sat in the middle of the table. Clara glanced at it once, but said nothing. Graham eventually nudged it toward her. "I found the last few chapters," he said softly, "in a thumb drive inside your desk drawer. You never printed them." She picked it up, ran her fingers over the linen cover. Her name was embossed in small gold letters. Saltwater Things. Extended Edition. By Clara Jensen. No fanfare. Just acknowledgement of her, of the voice she had nearly forgotten, of the woman who had lived 1,000 lifetimes in silence and still had more stories to tell. She didn't say thank you, not out loud, but her eyes did. After breakfast, they washed the dishes, together. He rinsed, She dried. Ethan, in the background, hummed to himself as he drew something a picture of 3 people at a table, with pancakes stacked high and a caption that read, "A good kind of different." Clara smiled. She reached into the drawer near the fridge, pulled out a small key silver, smooth from use. She didn't hand it to him directly, just placed it on the counter between them. He looked down, then up. No questions, no declarations, just quiet understanding. A kind of homecoming without fanfare. Later, as Graham put on his coat, Ethan followed him to the door. "Hey," he whispered, loud enough for Clara to hear. "If you want, we can keep you." Graham's laugh was soft. He looked at Clara. She looked back and said, with a smile that held years and seconds all at once, "We'll think about it." Years later, when journalists asked Graham Whitmore what moment had changed his life, he never mentioned the IPO. Not the day he rang the opening bell. Not the moment he bought out his biggest competitor. Not even the night he signed his name on the deed to the tallest glass building in Manhattan. He always paused for a moment, smiled faintly, and said, "It was a Tuesday night. She didn't know I was watching." That image stayed with him long after the headlines faded. Clara, in the boardroom, the city lights behind her, rain dripping slowly down the windows like tears trying to be subtle, and her sitting alone, shoulders curved inward, holding everything together until she couldn't. He hadn't known, then, what to do with the ache that curled in his chest. But he knew one thing: he couldn't look away. And he never had. Now, years later, the glass walls were behind them. They lived quietly, not hidden, just whole. Clara had left the foundation in steady hands and stepped fully into writing. Her debut memoir, The Strength in Quiet, had just been named one of the year's most important nonfiction books by The Atlantic. It wasn't a flashy book. It didn't scream. It didn't beg. It whispered. Stories of women who had bent without breaking, who had kept going with cracked hands and tired eyes, who had lived lives not meant for memoirs, and yet, Clara gave them pages. They lived in a small home not far from where the ocean kissed the coast of Maine. Not because they had to, because it was the place Clara had once only dared to dream of. And now, finally, it was real. The walls were lined with books, and sunlight pooled on the floors in the early morning like spilled honey. There was a porch swing, a kettle that whistled with attitude, and wind chimes that told time by movement rather than hours. Ethan had grown. He was nearly as tall as Graham now. He still wore mismatched socks and left crumbs everywhere, but he laughed with ease and wrote like someone twice his age. His second book was in draft. His blog had found its way into school curriculums. But more than that, he was well, and that for both Clara and Graham was everything. Some mornings, Graham would rise early, before even the gulls stirred, and make coffee while Clara sat at her desk by the window, long hair pulled up, pencil behind her ear, tapping thoughts into a worn laptop. He'd stand in the doorway, watching her, still undone by the fact that she was real and here. Not because he had fought for her, but because she had chosen to stay. That, he had learned, was the most sacred thing. When someone walks back in without needing to, they didn't need to say "I love you" every day, though they often did in their own ways, and how he folded her cardigans, and how she remembered which tea calmed his headaches, and how Ethan would shout "family hug," and they'd all roll their eyes but lean in anyway. There were no grand anniversaries, no diamonds, no spectacles, just groceries, Sunday crossword puzzles, and hands that knew exactly where to rest when silence arrived. It was a quiet life, and it was the best thing Graham had ever built. One afternoon, Clara found an old envelope tucked inside a first edition novel, yellowed at the corners. Slightly wrinkled, it was the letter she'd once written him, back when things had been uncertain, back when she'd slipped it into his mailbox at the office, unsigned. She'd forgotten all about it, but he hadn't. He'd kept it, tucked between pages, protected by time. She smiled as she read it again, the words still raw, still real. And when she walked into the living room with it, Graham didn't ask why she was holding it. He just said, "I read it once a year, same day, every year." She didn't ask which day. She didn't need to. Their home was near a cliffside trail that overlooked the sea. And on one particular morning, with sky the color of pearl and air laced with salt, they walked there together. All three. Clara barefoot in the sand, Graham carrying a basket with Ethan's favorite sandwiches, and Ethan running ahead, skipping stones and announcing clouds shaped like whales and dragons and pancakes. The ocean stretched endlessly before them, blue-gray and breathing. Clara stood still, her sweater tugged gently by the breeze. "This is the place I used to imagine," she whispered. Graham slid his hand into hers. They didn't speak for a while, but the quiet wasn't empty. It was full of the lives they'd lived, the ones they hadn't, and the one they now shared built not on rescue, but return. Ethan threw one last stone, letting it skip twice before sinking, then turned, squinting against the sun. "Can we stay here forever?" Clara laughed. "Forever's a long time." Graham said, "Let's start with the day." They sat together on the sand. No ceremony, no declarations, just the sound of waves writing lullabies against the shore. Clara leaned her head on Graham's shoulder. Ethan laid back with arms stretched wide. Above them, gulls circled. Behind them, footprints trailed messy and uneven, but theirs, and before them, the water, not an ending, just stillness, the kind that only comes after storms, after choices, after love that grows not from need, but from knowing. Some stories don't end with punctuation. They end with peace. And that day, on the beach she once only dreamed of, Clara Jensen was finally home. Because the billionaire CEO once saw his assistant cry, and instead of walking away, he stayed, and everything changed. Sometimes, the most profound connections begin not with grand gestures, but with quiet moments, a glance, a pause, a single act of noticing. This story reminds us that even in a world driven by success and appearances, what truly matters is presence, the courage to stay, to listen, to care without needing to fix. Clara didn't need rescuing, she needed to be seen. Graham didn't need to be a hero, he needed to unlearn his silence. It teaches us that everyone carries a burden we may never fully understand, but we can still walk beside them. We can still hold space for their pain, their dreams, their healing, and maybe the greatest form of love isn't loud, it's steady. It shows up in coffee cups, in handwritten notes, in staying even when leaving feels easier. So, wherever you are in life, whether you're building, breaking, or beginning again, know this: it's never too late to choose compassion, and it's never too quiet to change everything. Thank you for staying with us until the very end of this story. If it touched your heart, made you pause, or reminded you of something quietly beautiful in life, we're grateful you were here. Stories like this are meant to be shared. So, if it moved you, please like, share, and subscribe to our channel. Your support helps us continue telling stories that heal, inspire, and connect us all. See you in the next one. With warmth, always.